Hi, audience. Thanks for checking out my latest video. This is your host, Joseph Ramirez. Well, with all this coronavirus stay at home orders, I am out of work for at least 2 weeks or possibly more. So it gives me a lot of time right now to work on more videos. So, in today's video, I would like to discuss the controversial sanctuary movement in the United States. So, the sanctuary movement started back in the 1980s, and it was when churches here in the United States, many pastors and priests, were involved in taking in and hiding Central American refugees from U.S. immigration authorities to protect them from deportation. So let's give a little background to all this. Between 1980 and 1991, at least 1 million Central Americans tried to enter the United States illegally. Why were so many Central Americans fleeing? Because at that time there was horrific civil wars occurring in Guatemala and El Salvador and Nicaragua. During the Cold War era, the following civil wars occurred. There was the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted from 1960 to 1996. That was 36 years. And in El Salvador, the civil war there lasted from 1979 to 1992. And in Nicaragua, the Nicaraguan Revolution and the Civil War lasted from the 1970s until 1990. During that time, for example, in Guatemala, the different left-wing insurgent groups were waging a war against the Guatemalan military dictatorship, which was backed by the United States. And in El Salvador, the military dictatorship, which was allied with the United States, was fighting against left-wing guerrilla groups, which were trying to overthrow the military regime. And in Nicaragua, the U.S.-backed dictatorship, the Somoza family dynasty, was overthrown by the left-wing Sandinista guerrilla group. And in all these cases, it produced many refugees. When you're trying to immigrate to the United States legally, it is a long process. If you're trying to come from Guatemala and immigrate to the United States, you have to go to the U.S. Embassy and set up appointments. And you have to be screened and you have to be reviewed by the U.S. Embassy staff. They review your income level, your job skills, and if you will be a burden to the United States if you come. Many Guatemalans and Salvadorians, especially at that time, were very poor. So the United States did not view them as acceptable to take into the United States because they were too poor and they viewed them as financial burdens. However, many of these people were in survival mode, and there wasn't that many places to flee to if you're fleeing from Guatemala or El Salvador back in the 80s, because most other countries were also equally horrible dictatorships. The only democratic countries, stable ones, were Costa Rica, Venezuela, and Mexico. And so many Guatemalans and Salvadorians actually fled to Mexico, and some others decided to go through Mexico to get to the United States and try to apply for political asylum. At that time, in the 1980s, the United States was only taking in a 3% approval for asylum cases for Guatemalans and Salvadorians. The reason behind this was since Guatemala and El Salvador were frequent recipients of U.S. military aid, the U.S. did not want to acknowledge any of the human rights violations occurring in that country because it would get in the way of Congress approving further military aid. So when Ronald Reagan was president, the U.S. did not want to admit that any of these refugees were fleeing for political persecution, but they were just economic migrants, and so therefore it did not justify taking them all in and giving them asylum. Many Salvadorans and Guatemalans were deported if they tried to reach the United States and deported back to the country, facing death. So many churches were moved by this and decided, they were going to love their neighbor and show compassion. So many Catholic churches, as well as Protestant denominations, such as the Presbyterian Church and the Lutheran Church and even Baptist churches, started taking in Central American refugees and hiding them in their church to protect them from immigration authorities, from deportation. This angered the U.S. government, since it was officially breaking U.S. law to do that. So what ended up happening is the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Services, actually began arresting and cracking down on sanctuary movement members, including pastors and priests. Many pastors and priests ended up going to court and being put on trial for breaking the law, for taking in Central American refugees. So the sanctuary movement was very controversial, but they felt compelled to do something to help people who were in need, who were in danger of being deported back to possible imminent death. The other background is the United States was taking in other immigrant groups that fit into U.S. political interests at a better rate. For example, Cuban refugees coming to the United States had a 100% asylum acceptance rate. The United States would let in any Cuban, and that was because of the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966, because there were many Cubans fleeing the Castro dictatorship. And what happened is the United States would give automatic asylum to any Cuban. They were protected from deportation. They were given automatic federal benefits, such as welfare and food stamps and public housing. And Cubans could become a permanent U.S. resident just by living in the United States for just 1 year, and they had a faster track to citizenship than any other immigrant group. Unfortunately, that went on for decades, and there were some bad Cubans who came in some of those boat lifts from Cuba who went on to become criminals and yet could remain in the United States. The United States in the 1980s also gave a lot of asylum to Afghans fleeing the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And so these examples of U.S. immigration policies with Afghans and Cubans shows the flaws in U.S. immigration policies when it's purely based on political interests rather than trying to have a fair, balanced system. Instead of treating all refugees as legitimate victims, instead of playing favorites. And so by the mid 1980s, the US government realized there were too many of Central American refugees to deport. It would just be too difficult to deport all of them. And so Congress had to accommodate, they had to compromise and passed an immigration amnesty bill in 1986 that would allow the Central American immigrants who had arrived at that point amnesty and a protection from deportation as long as they didn't uh, commit crimes. And this provided a future path for citizenship for many people from Guatemala and El Salvador. And to this day, where do we stand right now with the Central American immigration issue? Well, we are dealing with a near identical problem. Since the 2010s, there have been numerous caravans in the news fleeing from countries in Central America like Honduras. Once again, the driving factors tend to be political repression and violence, poverty, and instability. And many people, like countries like from Honduras, flee to Mexico and towards the United States. And this leads us to what is the response currently in the United States towards all these immigration caravans from Central America. Well, the US government, especially under the Trump administration, is taking a very tough stance against illegal immigration, condemning it, speaking out against it, and cracking down on illegal immigrants in this country, stepping up deportations, and doing everything it can to prevent Central Americans from even trying to come into Mexico, and putting pressure on Mexico to not even let them enter. And in the churches in the United States, many are still continuing the practice of taking in Central American refugees and sheltering them from immigration authorities. And that is causing friction between the government and these churches. This is a difficult debate because many feel and believe that the role of the church should be to honor authorities and the law and obey it. But there have been times in history where the church has disobeyed the law, including in the United States, towards laws they felt were moral or unfair or unjust. It is a difficult debate, and I'll leave that up to you what your answer should be. In the comments section, go ahead and leave your opinion on this. In the meantime, if you would like to read up more on the sanctuary movement and its role today, you can read that on many different sources online. I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to this video. Stay informed, everybody.